Good late afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming to our virtual event. I'm Veronica Reyes Escudero. I'm the Catherine B. Willock Head of Special Collections, and I'm happy to welcome you today to our event, even though it's virtual. We can't wait until we get to the point where we can have you all come to Special Collections and see you all in person. I think we all kind of missed that that time with our people. So we welcome you though. And ahead of that, I want to make sure that I read our land grant statement. I want to say that we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Adam and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I want to welcome you all to the films of Andrew Ellicott Douglass, astronomer, archaeologist, and father of tree ring dating, a virtual panel discussion. I'm always excited to have these events. We love to provide opportunities for researchers, whether they are from our campus faculty community or outside of the campus, to discuss the ways in which source documentation supports their research and how our heritage institutions help to better understand the human experience from a multidisciplinary perspective. This project that Trent and Amanda and the others will be speaking about was made possible by Recordings at Risk grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLEAR for short. CLEAR is an independent nonprofit organization and forges strategies to enhance research, teaching, and learning environments in collaboration with libraries, cultural institutions, and communities of higher learning. The specific grant that we got, or that Amanda and Trent got, the Recordings at Risk grant program supports the preservation of rare and unique audiovisual, and other time-based media of high scholarly value through digital reformatting. We are grateful for their financial support. And just as importantly, we are grateful for our panelists for being so gracious with their time and effort given to this event. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. David Frank, who will be participating as moderator and will introduce the rest of the panel. Dr. David Frank has been the director of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona since 2016. He had a long biography, but he allowed us to shorten it. And just to say that he has been hooked on dendrochronology since his undergraduate studies and remains excited about the interdisciplinary applications and frontiers of tree ring research. You should know, however, that Dr. Frank has over 100 publications that contribute to improving knowledge of the coupling between long-term environmental variation and tree growth. We are so excited to have all of our panelists here, and I thank them for their gracious time. So with no more further ado, I'll ask Dr. Frank to introduce the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for the warm introduction and the kind introduction. It is for me an honor to help moderate this event centered around the now preserved, digitized, and accessible films from Andrew Ellicott Douglass. I would firstly like to express my thanks to the University of Arizona Special Collections, and including also this evening's panelists, Amanda Howard and Trent Purdy, for making so many facets of Douglass's legacy, including the major undertaking to secure the footage from the films we will learn about tonight. So that's really tremendous for so many different communities. So thank you from my side. Andrew Ellicott Douglass could be the focus of many lectures or books, and he already has been. But if I had to capture his scientific trajectory in one sentence, it would be this. The story of Andrew Ellicott Douglass is a story of an astronomer who, to understand how our sun's variability impacts Earth's climate, established the field of dendrochronology. Yet he made his biggest scientific breakthrough in the field of archaeology. So a sentence with many commas. For me, this epitomizes the legacy of interdisciplinary research excellence at the University of Arizona. It is also the spirit that we carry forward today at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research as we continually explore and advance new interdisciplinary frontiers for dendrochronology. And lastly, this interdisciplinary mindset is embodied in today's panel discussion and presentations. We bring together 4 panelists from widely different backgrounds, but all with interests and connections to these films from Andrew Ellicott Douglass. And in this same vein, I would like to thank you, the audience, for joining and being part of this event. Welcome. As was mentioned, just one housekeeping item. So we're very happy for your questions, and we'll be using the chat function. So please feel free to enter them at any time, and we'll do our best to collate them and save them for the panel discussion at the end of the presentation. The first speakers are Amanda Howard and Trent Purdy. Amanda Howard is a certified archivist specializing in the stewardship of audiovisual materials at the University of Arizona Library's Special Collections. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and master's degrees in media arts and library and information science. Amanda is also co-curator and oral historian on a project chronicling club nights in Glasgow, Scotland. And Trent Purdy, the co-speaker, is a multimedia and digital collections archivist at the University of Arizona Library Special Collections. He received his BA in Media Arts and MA in Information Resources and Library Science from the University of Arizona. He is a certified archivist as well. So Trent and Amanda, it's all yours.
All right.
Thank you.
You want to share a slide?
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Frank, and thank you to everyone who is joining us. This evening, Amanda and I will give a brief overview of special collections, the work we do as audiovisual archivists, and the digitization of the A.E. Douglass Motion Pictures project funded by the Council on Library and Information Resources Recording at Risk grants. So first off, University of Arizona Special Collections was founded in 1958 and provides access to primary source research materials that document the rich history of Arizona, the Southwest, and the borderlands regions. Special Collections has 7 collecting areas: Arizona Southwest, the US-Mexico borderlands, literature, political affairs, performing arts, University of Arizona, and the history of science. Among our collections, we hold the A.E. Douglass papers, which consist of materials related to his research and career. Dr. Douglass was an American astronomer, educator, and founder of the science of dendrochronology. Douglass was associated with the Harvard College Observatory from 1889 to 1894 in its expedition to Peru, the Lowell Observatories in Flagstaff, Arizona from 1894 to 1901, and during his time at the University of Arizona from 1906 to 1962, Dr. Douglass served as professor, dean, acting president, and first director of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, as well as the Stewart Observatory. It was thanks to the efforts of Dr. Douglass, in fact, that the Stewart Observatory was established. So as archivists, we are committed to the professional ethics of preservation of and access to primary source materials. Audiovisual materials pose a unique set of stewardship issues from paper-based materials. Deterioration, lack of access to obsolete playback equipment, and funding to digitize and preserve audiovisual materials are just some of the risks for preserving audiovisual content. In fact, a 2012 report published by the Library of Congress stated that many analog recordings held by archives must be digitized within the next 15 to 20 years before carrier degradation and the challenges of acquiring and maintaining playback equipment make the success of these efforts too expensive or unattainable. Simply stated, we must digitize audiovisual holdings now or risk permanently losing valuable research content. As audiovisual archivists, Amanda and I steward audiovisual holdings at Special Collections and are faced with the same challenges as the profession. Due to the high cost of digitizing audiovisual content and a lack of available funding, we have to strategize and seek out opportunities to securing funding to preserve collections that contain a large number of at-risk holdings with high research values. So when I started in my current role over 5 years ago as a multimedia and digital collections archivist, I conducted a survey of our audiovisual holdings at Special Collections, and I was intrigued by several boxes labeled A.E. Douglass films in our backlog. I opened a box and was confronted by an assortment of film cans and boxes with mysterious words like cycloscope and planetary interpolator written on them. I was also nearly knocked over by an overwhelming vinegar aroma, which alerted me that these films were in an advanced state of decay. Actions needed to be taken to preserve these films or risk losing what was surely valuable scientific research forever. Given that there were so many films, I knew that the cost of digitization would be substantial and outside of our allotted AV digitization budget. The films in this collection were under the stewardship of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research until 1996, when the department transferred the films to Special Collections. In early 2018, we met with Dr. Frank to discuss the films, and he was very enthusiastic about our future plans to preserve the materials and make them accessible to researchers. Thank you, Dr. Frank. Thankfully, Amanda was hired in 2017 to provide further support to the stewardship of audiovisual materials. The films from the Douglass collection were prioritized for digitization, and we decided with support from our library administrators, thank you, library administrators, that we should pursue grant funding opportunities to support this work. So let's fast forward to late 2019. We applied to the Clear Recordings at Risk grant to fund digitization of the films. As Veronica mentioned in her intro, the grant was established by Clear in 2017 to provide support for the preservation of rare and unique audiovisual media of high scholarly value through digital reformatting. Luckily, in March of 2020, we were awarded $39,000 to digitize the A.E. Douglass films and build out a digital collection to provide streaming access to the films, some of which will be featured during Dr. Geiken and Dr. Pearson's talks. We are very grateful to Clear and other like-minded nonprofit funding organizations that understand the work we as archival professionals do to ensure the preservation of and access to unique primary source materials. Without funding from Clear, these films would still be at risk for further deterioration or loss. We're also very thankful to Dr. Frank and Dr. Geiken, who provided letters of support for the grant, and to Dr. Jennifer Jenkins for the previous work she did to ensure preservation of the films. Just as a plug for Clear, Clear is currently accepting applications for the next call for the Recordings at Risk grant program, and the application deadline is December 15th, awarded for projects completed between May 22nd and April 2023.
So when I was given this collection to archivally process, which basically means to inspect, organize, describe, and house the films in archival containers, I was thrilled to be working with one-of-a-kind film and preserving part of the university's legacy. Special Collections actually doesn't have a lot of motion picture film. We mostly handle video and audio tape, and I knew this was a rare opportunity. What I didn't know was how significant the project would become, how impressive Douglass's scholarship was, or the importance of the films to his work. As a professor and dendrochronology pioneer, Douglass was an early adopter of amateur movie making technology. He recorded his academic undertakings in astronomy, climate science, and the tree ring record, as we've heard already, which illuminated the chronology of human settlement in the southwestern United States. He produced early film images of archaeological sites in Arizona and documented breakthroughs in the scientific practices and research from the 1920s through the 1950s that he was involved in as they happened. The film's significance across scientific disciplines and implications for interdisciplinary study cannot be overstated, especially as the University of Arizona continues to lead in the fields of tree ring research, climate science, planetary science, and astronomy. As Trent has mentioned, before I ever came into the picture, this collection was exhibiting obvious olfactory signs that it was in need of archival intervention. While it had been housed in better conditions for the past 30 or so years in Special Collections than it had in the 5 decades prior that it lived in the basement of Arizona Stadium, at least a third of the films were at high risk for autocatalytic decay. And autocatalytic decay is just a film archivist's way of saying that the film was slowly self-destructing. It was basically consuming itself. We've written elsewhere in our ongoing library news updates on the project about the journey this collection has taken in the handful of years we've personally stewarded it. And it's important to note that A.E. Douglass created these films. He was actually thinking about their longevity and legacy as he was making them. His papers hold correspondence with Eastman Kodak, Paramount, and smaller film suppliers to determine proper care of both his nitrate motion picture films and photographic materials to withstand the heat of Tucson summers while stored in the stadium. It's partially due to his foresight in maintaining the films that they were still here for us to find. It should also be noted that Douglass's impulse to preserve motion pictures was not a universal one. For example, most commercial film studios that were working contemporaneously to Douglass viewed their products as ephemeral and disposable. Douglass was forward-thinking even in that regard. In fact, in a 2013 study, the Library of Congress estimated that about 70% of feature-length films from the silent era alone have been lost due to neglect. The neglect of newsreels, documentaries, anthropological and regional films, and amateur home movies, genres under which some of these films fall, is even more alarming. Like any of his multitude of scientific undertakings, Douglass approached filmmaking and the care of those films with the same painstaking, methodical eye. It should be noted that the films also demonstrate that his achievements weren't accomplished alone. There were plenty of unnamed or unseen faces that made it all possible, like the student who spent a blistering Tucson summer in the lab determining precise measurements to integrate a camera into a cycloscope, or the unidentified woman in a film we'll see tonight, meticulously creating cycle plots. So while we may call Douglass an amateur filmmaker, it's only in the sense that his films were not commercial productions, but they were created in a manner every bit as professional in their own right. The films are therefore both documents and experiments in themselves. Even when Douglass was testing his equipment like the cycloscope, shooting gatherings at his home, making stray recordings of Tucson streets, he was capturing sometimes mundane but indelible moments in time. Among Douglass's correspondence I referred to below, I found an exchange of letters with Eastman Kodak from the 1940s, 1948 in fact, which you can see up here on this slide, attempting to track down the whereabouts of lost still photograph exposures that he'd shot at Mormon Lake in northern Arizona. He goes into detail about the changes he'd observed over 40 years at the location and the film's importance to documenting the change in climate. And in an instant, the letter boils down Douglass's lifelong concerns as a scientist and the central role photography and motion pictures played in those pursuits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trent and Amanda, for this overview and the many hours of work that went behind it. Our next speaker is Dr. Oliver Guyton. He's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he is currently director of the Comparative Literature Program. He has published widely on the intersection of cinema and science. His book, Devices of Curiosity, Early Cinema and Popular Science, appeared with Oxford University Press in the spring of 2015. He is the consultant for Medicine on Screen, a web project at the National Library of Medicine. Oliver, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. And thanks also to Amanda and Trent for the invitation to write a letter in support of this project and for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm going to provide a brief panorama of the uses of cinema in science up to and sort of overlapping with Douglass's career. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So it's well known that the origins of cinema are indebted to scientific research. The two most frequently cited points of reference for this claim are the so-called fathers of cinema, Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marais, whose experiments with chronophotography are rightly seen as precursors to the cinema's basic technology. And here we have a representative, perhaps the most famous image that Edward Muybridge made, a chronophotograph of the horse in motion, and made into an animated GIF on the right. And here some images from the work of Etienne Jules Marais that shows his somewhat different technique of successive exposures on a single plate, which allowed him to investigate various kinds of movement, locomotion. Both of these investigators were interested in visualizing something that the eye couldn't apprehend. And here's another Marais image. And this task was taken up directly by a number of people, including researchers like Lucien Bull, who worked at the institute that then bore Marais' name. So you see here in this image, which is actually a stereoscopic image of a projectile bursting a soap bubble, a lot of the hallmarks of this early use of chronophotography and then cinematography, the ability to manipulate time, so in this case, extreme slow motion, and also the ability to make the image into a precision measurement device. So you have the scale, and both visual and time scale there. What's less well known is that cinema and science remained commingled beyond this initial moment in the late 19th century. So into the 20th, there's this very rapid adoption of cinema and science in a variety of ways. And it remains one of the, I think, least understood aspects of cinema's history. There are myriad stories to be told, however, and this conjunction of science and cinema persisted and flourished over the course of the 20th century. And it continues to be a site of exploration and discovery today. And from the beginning, there's a spectrum from popular science, and here is an image from one of the first, from the first popular science film series made in England by F. Martin Duncan, The Unseen World, to Jean Commandant, the most prominent scientific filmmaker of the teens, whose career continues well into the post-World War II period. So I want to briefly look now at the fields, the areas in which Douglass's films might be assigned. So thinking first of all of astronomy, here is the first extant astrophotograph. This is a daguerreotype of the moon from 1840 by John William Draper. And astronomy, so astronomy and photography have an extremely long history. Look next at the beginnings of the incorporation of movement. And this is Jules Janssen's photographic revolver, which was put together to provide insight into the transit of Venus in an eclipse in 1874. So on the left, you see an engraving of the apparatus, and on the right, you see a frame from this daguerreotype. But astronomy's use of photography tended to go in a direction other than that of cinematography. Indeed, the typical use of photography in astronomy was long exposure, which allowed for the imaging of celestial objects too faint to be seen by the human eye. Although I think there are kind of analogous projects in the history of astronomy that may have been an inspiration for Douglass, in particular, the use of photography to create archives. And the Carte de Ciel project in particular is of note because I am interested in how it, even though it was seen as a kind of an overly ambitious quasi-failure at the time that it was done, has more recently turned out to be a source of considerably useful and interesting data. And I wonder if we might not put Douglass's films into a similar frame. Another major research area to which Douglass's films belong is that of botany. And here we see early time-lapse films created by Wilhelm Pfeffer in Leipzig. This is 1898 to 1900. So here we see the blooming of tulips. And Pfeffer was interested in this primarily from the perspective of an educator. Here's another example of plant process. Here's the rooting behavior of a fava bean. You'll note there are two here because what he's done on the left is to cut the tip, the radical off of that root, and you see the difference in terms of the direction of the growth. And here too, there's a spectrum from the use as a scientific and educational tool to a more popular application. This is the title frame from Percy Smith's The Birth of a Flower from 1910, a film that was wildly popular when it came out. And I guess the third discipline to which we could link Douglass's research is archaeology, which I think has a lot of overlap with astronomy in terms of being a scientific discipline whose use of cinema was relatively peripheral. But as has been mentioned, Douglass also used the camera, or the word that I'm kind of coming back to here is the word amateur. So Douglass is using 16mm film relatively early. It's introduced in 1923. So Douglass is what I think we would call an early adopter. And here's an image from the 30s for Kodak home movies, which gives us, I think, a typical image for the kinds of scenarios, life events for which this technology was envisaged. But in the same period, you have kind of a range as well here. And so I think this ad, which is made to leverage the World's Fair of 1939, this opening phrase, "Only a movie camera gives you the complete record," starts to point towards an interesting overlap between so-called amateur and scientific uses. So this idea of a complete record, and if you go through and read the text here of the ad, it emphasizes the ability to use the camera to make the experience shareable and repeatable. So, wouldn't it be great to be able to go to the fair, but then also to have that experience so that you can show it to your friends and relive it yourself over and over again? And this notion of creating enduring records is, I think, critical to understanding Douglass's use of film. And I want to turn now to some specific examples of this pretty substantial collection, and help to and start to think about sort of how his work fits into these traditions that I've just sketched out. So here's a first example. This is one of several films of the planetary interpolator. So this is astronomical information, and in the middle you see 1890 is the year, and now 1891 and the months and the days. And so you see around the disk the position of planets, which can also then be calibrated, or I'm not sure exactly how it works. I'd be curious to know more about this. But this is a really fascinating use of film. So he's got an instrument that he's recording, and he's taking advantage of film's ability to be exposed frame by frame to make this instrument shareable. And so anyone who has this film or has a record of it has the ability to have access to this same information about planetary motion. And I want to just go ahead here because 1895, this of course is the this is the year of the birth of cinema, which I thought was a neat little coincidence, or I decided to create this coincidence. So that's an example of his use of film as an instrument, as a scientific instrument. But there are a lot of other films in the collection that have a different quality to them. And I want to show here an initial example. And this is from a visit to a burn site, so a forest fire in that affected some redwoods. And you notice the kind of very typical editing pattern of the home movie here. The editing that is dictated by sort of interest. So at the moment you see something interest, you turn the camera on, then you turn it off, and then it lies there until you find something else interesting. And then this shift to a much more detailed look at a particular object. So here, the cross section of a tree. And I think this is one of these kind of boundary films, of which there are many in the collection, that show how Douglass's home movies are actually full of science. His vacations are often work trips. So for him, science is an everyday activity, I think, like it is for most scientists. Another example of that here, this film, which is really interesting because it's just titles. So title cards for the films prompts the question immediately, you know, is it possible to recreate some of the sort of finished products, which I would love to see if that's possible. But here near the end of this reel of titles, you get this moment. Just this sort of shaky pan over his desk. Which I actually find quite an interesting and fascinating and kind of moving moment. Utterly quotidian, in a lot of ways mysterious, like why was this considered worth including in the film, or was it just, you know, because he was trying to use up the last frames on the reel before sending it out to be developed? But it gives a kind of insight into his life and into his scientific work that is, I think, quite unusual. And so then the final, so in a sense, throughout the films, there are these moments of where it seems to be that he's using the film camera as something like a scientific notebook, where he's jotting down things, but he's doing it in a visual way. And that's the last film here that I want to take a look at a moment from. This is a film in the geology section. It's quite long compared to the others, about 16 plus minutes. And it's a fascinating film. I'd love to watch the whole thing and talk about it, but I will jump ahead. It's a process film. So you see him collecting geological samples in Sweden. And we get to the end, and he's demonstrating the various techniques that he has to make sense of some of the samples that he's collected. And you note here the sort of the multimedia quality of his work. So he's sampling, and then he's drawing, and he's photographing, he's creating machines, he's working with maps. And then right at the end here, after these maps, you get also a little moment of him with his friend. This, again, inner connection of his life. So he poses briefly and then goes right back. Sometimes it seems like for him, the film camera and a still camera are sort of similar. You see him collecting images here, the sign of the institute where he was working, and then what I guess was the place where he stayed, the hotel. So there's this accretion of bits of everyday life in and among the observations, faces, interior scenes, social moments. So again, I think this is a kind of a really interesting aspect of this collection, that you have the possibility of writing a different kind of scientific biography. And the last image I want to share is this. So to conclude, I wonder whether the similarity between a reel of film and a tree cross-section occurred to Douglass. And I wonder whether this might have been a meaningful similarity for him. For myself, I see both of these objects as time machines that exemplify the importance of creating records for an unknown future, which underscores the importance of caring for these artifacts in the present. So thanks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for this very insightful overview and your perspectives. I, as a dendrochronologist, learned so much from your background, and thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Charlotte Pearson, who is a geoarchaeologist and dendrochronologist interested in developing new applications of the tree ring record to examine past human and environmental interactions and improve chronological frameworks. She is an associate professor in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research with joint appointments in the School of Anthropology and the Geoscience Department. Her current research focuses on novel applications for analyses of carbon-14 in single tree rings, dendrochronological approaches to the chronology of the ancient Mediterranean, and dendrochemical approaches to dating the onset of environmental disturbances, in particular volcanic eruptions. Charlotte. Please.
Hi, right, let me just share my screen. And so I'm very, very privileged to have this opportunity to talk about these quite remarkable, amazing scientific windows into the past. And I thank you, Oliver, for such a lovely, completely different take on these movies that I've become quite familiar with while I've been sort of researching for this project. And thank you for saving them. Thank you so much, guys, for saving them, because these are just amazing. And I hope everyone's noted that the link to the exhibition is in the chat, and that you should just copy paste that and spend some time looking at these in their length after this is done. So anyway, I'm from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. I'm very proud to represent the laboratory here today. You'll see that now we occupy this rather nice location on campus with our fancy building. And if you are passing, please call in to the lobby, have a look at this giant redwood section. I'm going to be showing you some pictures of that later on. There's some other items in here that are actually featured in some of the movies. And so you can make your own direct connection with the past by visiting the lab. So as we've heard already, Douglass is regarded as the father of dendrochronology. And although there were earlier mentions of observations that trees have rings, and in fact Leonardo da Vinci comments that trees have annual rings, annual growth, and that the thickness of the tree ring is determined by the conditions in which the tree grows, which is one of the fundamentals of dendrochronology. But it wasn't until the astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglass started to be interested in solar cycles. These are sunspot images, and the connection of solar activity with climate and that impact on tree growth, that the techniques of dendrochronology or tree ring science were pioneered and formalized. And that is what Douglas did. He noted that in the southwest, where we are, as you would expect, the major limiting factor on the growth of trees is how much water is available. So he noticed that in trees, when there was not much water, you got narrow rings. And when there was more water, you got wider rings. And that these patterns of wide and narrow rings provide us with a unique barcode kind of pattern of climate through time that can be used to synchronize records from multiple trees across a region. How it works is you start with your living tree and you look at these tree ring patterns, you maybe measure these tree ring patterns, and then you obtain older material and you do the same thing, an older material. And in this way, we can build these long sequences by matching these patterns together, finding our points of overlap and adding in lots and lots of trees for a region. We provide these long series of data, which not only can be used to date things in a particular region, but they can also be used to reconstruct the environmental conditions in the time that the trees grew. Now, our method starts with, and let's pretend we've just been on a virtual field trip up to Mount Lemmon, just outside Tucson, as you're going to see Douglas do in a minute. And we have taken a sample from a tree, and we have looked at this tree ring under the bark, and we know that this is the tree ring that formed in this year. So here's our 2021. So then this is our 2020. This is our 2019, and so on and so forth. So we apply a calendar dating system to trees with annual growth. And what you see here is our non-destructive, non-damaging technique for removing a very small amount of tree sample that the tree then rapidly heals, which we can then take back to the lab, prepare, and use to measure and to get our data. So the first clip that I've chosen to show you is Douglas's version of this. This is Douglas's intro dendro, and he made it with his student Edmund Shulman. And here they are, and they're in their field vehicle. And if you watch the clip in its entirety, you'll see the field vehicle at the end of the clip. And they are on Mount Lemmon, and they obviously went there multiple times, or Douglas did when he was trying to make these kinds of films. So here you see Douglas, no snow, and here you see Shulman with snow. And just watch what he's doing. Exactly what we do today to take a sample. He's got this Swedish borer, which is a hollow metal cylinder with a cutting tip at the end. And he is winding that into the tree. And as he winds that hollow borer into the tree, it collects a sample of wood, which he's now going to extract. And you see that the piece of wood has come out of the tree. You can see the bark on the left-hand side. And he's demonstrating how that sample was taken, just like we would today. And now we cut straight to the lab. And this is the second step. The sample has been mounted in a core mount, and it's been prepared so that we can see those patterns of wide and narrow rings. Exactly the same then as it is today, and exactly the kind of composition that we would put into our teaching and our outreach today. So moving to the next clip. Douglas was way ahead of his time in so many ways. And I wanted to talk about this instrument, the cycloscope, or one version of the cycloscope. There are many kind of iterations of this type of instrumentation. And this was one of the primary ways that Douglas was developing to explore this relationship between solar activity and the growth of trees and climate. And I have two clips to show you. The first, both of which are of students of Douglas using this equipment, and will demonstrate some of how it works. The first is of, has been mentioned already, and it's a female working in the tree ring lab with Douglas. We're not entirely certain of who it is. I would love to think that it was Florence Hawley Ellis, who was an absolute pioneer of the dendrochronological method and a very famous and influential anthropologist in her own right. But this is just a beautiful demonstration of the long plot method, and then how this relates to the preparation of samples to put in the cycloscope. So you can see she's sort of winding that paper around the wheel, and she's marking off the positions to show the tree ring patterns. And I think it could, she certainly shares Florence's taste in very nice jewelry. So I wonder. Now she's marking out those plots. And then here we have a bit of cinematography, explaining what's going on. The values are plotted and traced through to make the cycle plots. So here are the tree ring patterns, the values that are plotted and then cut out, sort of stenciled, so that light can pass through them. Okay, and then the next one, we're going to see Shulman actually operating the cycloscope. And you can see we've got a series of lenses, we've got a series of mirrors, all of this kind of moves up and down, back and forth. And here we have some of those plots that you saw in the last clip. And you see, so now we have the lights being shone through the plots. And this was Douglas's way to try and put lots of data together and analyze it all in one go to see if there was a correlation with sunspots and with solar activity. And of course, today, we would use a computer. We have many different ways to approach such problems, but this was absolutely kind of a unique approach for its time. Along the bottom here, you're sort of seeing the solar cycles. So that 5 there, it's looking for these different solar cycles. And that the last one that you saw was the 11.5 solar cycle. And that was one of the findings that Douglas was particularly interested in the early 1900s. Here you see the mirror being moved back and forth as part of that instrument. Now, if you're interested in that, there's look out for a Center for Creative Photography exhibition, which I believe will utilize some of this footage, and the cycloscope, which we still have. And that's going to be January to July of next year. Coming up again, look on our signal, there's our 11 and a half. And now we're going to go back to the sun plot around about 11, so to the sunspot plot around about 11 and a half. Okay. So moving from Douglas just back to Shulman, Shulman actually went on to be one of the pioneers of the bristlecone pine chronology. And the bristlecone pines are the world's longest living trees. One individual tree may live for around 5,000 years. And so the work of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research since its inception almost has been partially tied up with building chronologies from these remarkable samples. And I wanted to just segue a little bit into work that a number of us are now pursuing in the Tree Ring Lab using the bristlecone pine samples, where we're kind of doing what Douglas thought could be done. He was approaching it through cycles, and we're approaching it through chemistry. So we are reconstructing the behavior of the sun through chemical measurements of bristlecone pine tree rings. And the way this works is that the interaction of particles in the atmosphere, cosmic radiation, intensified by things like solar flare events, will produce carbon-14, the radioactive isotope, which is taken up with carbon-13 and carbon-12 into the tree as it photosynthesizes. So basically what that means is every single dated year in over 9,000 calendar dated tree rings of bristlecone pine is a time capsule for how much carbon-14 there was in the environment. And what this allows us to do is to reconstruct the amount of the solar variability through time. And we're now seeing those 11-year solar cycles as a chemical trace rather than the trace through the ring widths that Douglas was looking for. Okay. Again, into the present, and I'm going to move on to my next clip. And again, I really encourage you to reach out and come and visit the Tree Ring Lab and have a look at our archive. I'm about to show you some footage of what the archive was like in Douglas's time. There we go. So you see some of the samples, and all of these samples are still stored in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research archive, now climate controlled. And then the second bit, this is Douglas explaining the Pueblo timeline. And this is a series of photographs. So another example of the way he's using multimedia, he's using lots of different approaches. Here he's got photographs of the tree rings in a chronology. So that sort of pattern of wiggles that I showed you in some of the first slide, this is the actual visualization of it through photography. And he's pointing out dates and times and markers within this timeline. And if you come to the tree ring lab, I promised you the redwood section, you'll also see in the background here, look, the Pueblo timeline. And you can walk up and down that timeline just like Douglas did, and you can look at those dates that he was showing to people in that film. Now, by 1929, there comes this kind of magical moment for the establishment of dendrochronology, the demonstration of this amazing contribution that can be made to how we understand the past, the environment, and how people interacted with it. And it comes in 1929 when Douglas publishes his latest results in the National Geographic magazine. At this point, he's made his record of tree ring data from living trees, and he's got a nice record back this far. And he's also been out to a load of archaeological sites, and he's found lots of matching tree ring patterns from those archaeological sites. But the patterns of those tree rings do not match the patterns in his historic tree rings. So he knows that the archaeological stuff comes from an earlier time, but he doesn't know exactly when. And then at this sort of marker point, there's this discovery in Show Low, Arizona, of this sample called HH39. And it's a carbonized piece of wood. And it just happens that the patterns in this piece of wood overlap with the end portion of the historic chronology, the starting portion of the historic chronology, and with the end portion of the prehistoric chronology. And what this meant was there was a bridge, and there's this amazing description. If you're interested in this topic and you want to email me, I'll send you a reference. I'll send you this paper, because Emil Howry, another of the great minds of the time, was with Douglas in the hut as Douglas is actually working out this bridge between the chronologies. And there's this wonderful description of the flickering oil lamp, and Douglas bent over those strips of paper and then looking up and finally declaring for the very first time ever a calendar dated history for sites, iconic sites like Mesa Verde, like Chaco Canyon, dated to within a calendar date. And it was just such an incredible story, and it really kind of seeded the many diverse applications of tree ring science for anyone around the world, and it's why it's being pursued so strongly today. Also within this this publication is a mention of human and environmental interaction, because Douglas links these wet years that he sees in the tree ring record with periods of expansion in the archaeological record. When there's more rain, the trees do well and the people do well. And then when there are droughts, he sees things slow up, less building. And finally, with some droughts, he sees abandonment. And so these are really fundamental concepts, very much linked with the absolute, cutting edge science that's happening today and is very relevant to our world today, and is based around this concept of a proxy record. So I'm just going to segue into proxy records just really briefly. What we do with a proxy record is we sample actual data. We take measurements through time. And so this is our measured time period. We're talking here about rain. So here we got less rain, here we got more rain, less rain, more rain, less rain, so on. That is a direct observed measurement. Now, if we then take something like tree rings, which isn't a direct measurement, but it's as good as, it can be used instead of, as a substitute for. And we compare what our tree rings are doing against our measured data. Then we can feel confident, if we have a line here that matches, that we can extend the record of, in this case, rainfall, back way beyond the time period for which we have measured data. And this proxy record is fundamental and very, very important to our lives today. And the last clip that I want to show you is actually one that Oliver showed you as well. It's from the trip to Sweden with De Geer. And when I saw this, I was kind of literally jumping up and down, because it just blew me away. We've got tree rings with marker patterns that synchronize through time. And then over in Sweden, we have these layers of mud in lakes, which De Geer, the father of Varv chronology, has demonstrated that he can use similar cross-matching techniques to date. He's also demonstrated that these are annual, like tree growth. And these are two of the most precise proxy records and still are today. And to see the two of these scientists together was just really mind-blowing for me. So I've stitched together a little bit of this, and I do encourage you to watch the whole thing. I also wanted to show you this photograph. So here's Douglas looking at photographs, presumably on a board somewhere around De Geer's lab. And this picture was on my textbook when I was an undergraduate at university learning about paleoenvironmental reconstruction. And I wanted to show you this just as a parallel. Here is Douglas filming De Geer taking a section of varves. So in the same way we saw Schulman putting a hollow metal cylinder into a tree to get a sample of tree, here is De Geer putting a hollow metal container into a muddy section to get a sample of varves. So he's going to take that out, and then he's going to scrape that off. And then you see his method. And again, you know, here's that kind of plotting method. He's marking off the boundaries of these annual layers of mud accumulation. And there we, yeah, okay. And then we've got Douglas cleaning that up, having a look at it. And then my absolute favorite bit is this last bit, and it does go on for some time. So I encourage you to look at this and enjoy it. But in a moment, they're going to start cleaning mud off their boots. This was my favorite bit. It's just such an amazing little snapshot into these two great scientists, fathers of a discipline, in the field, cleaning the mud off their boots. Loved it. So to bring this to the present day, you may have focused on the recent IPCC report, which has quotes in it such as this one: recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. We can say in science that a change is unprecedented in thousands of years because of the founding work of people like Douglas and De Geer in developing proxy records, because the proxy record gives us the knowledge that something is unprecedented in a period of time. We also live in a time where we've suddenly actually become much more vulnerable to the activity of the sun, not just through the impact on climate of solar activity, but more specifically because we have a societal infrastructure that relies on satellites surrounding our planet that are actually quite sensitive to things like solar flares. And so now from those annual records of carbon-14 in tree rings, we'll be able to develop a proxy that will tell us how often such events happen and what sort of magnitude they have, and maybe the precursors for them. And we're also living in a time of, you know, these dramatic fires, and we saw some footage of Douglas visiting the redwoods after another fire. And only in the last couple of weeks, some of the world's most iconic trees have been, you know, under threat. All around the world, trees are dying in their environments because of the changes that are going on. And all of this history of science, this archival process, is so important for preserving the science and the knowledge for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this presentation and overview, connecting a third facet of the work from Douglas. And I'd like to take this chance to thank all of the speakers and move into a panel discussion where I welcome all of the guests to type questions into the chat. And we're happy to address them. I know that we've pushed the timeline, but I think everyone can hopefully stay around for a few more minutes to ask your questions. The first question that I see is films were in various stages of decay, that is nitrate films or safety film that was stored in poor conditions in the West Stadium. And I think this is a question relating to the storage, and that's probably addressed to Trent and Amanda. Are you able to share a little bit more about the condition of the films and their need for this grant that you obtained?
Yeah, so I can answer that. Douglas did shoot some 35mm films on nitrate, and those were transferred to safety film. The nitrate was disposed of. This was before my and Trent's time in special collections, and probably even before the films actually came to special collections. So the majority of his films were done on cellulose acetate film. All 16mm films were some form of acetate base. So not as dangerous and potentially explosive as nitrate. So that's good. And they therefore persisted much longer than many nitrate films because the base was more stable. Did I get everything there?
Yeah, and just one thing I wanted to, one of the things I just wanted to add was that, you know, we go into really deep detail about the process involved in working on this grant. And one of the blog posts that we wrote, which I shared in the chat, Amanda did extensive work at doing tests on to see how acidic and how much decay some of the films are facing. And so if you have a real interest in that, I recommend looking at this blog, because Amanda did really significant and substantial and wonderful work on this grant, and I think it's worth reading.
So follow-up question related to that, and if somebody wants to message me directly, if you don't want to have your name showing up as the asker of a question, you're feel free to do that, and I'll represent that anonymously. But the question is also a follow-up to you, Trent and Amanda. What were the most challenging and most rewarding parts of this project?
So I'll start with the rewarding part, and I have to apologize for me going in and out of being blurry. It's our camera, but you know, I promise I'm still here. This project was very rewarding. It's multifaceted and how rewarding I think it was for both Amanda and myself. One of the most rewarding things, this is the first grant that I had written and acted as the first PI on. And so just learning that process and working through it and learning how to write a successful grant was, I feel really proud for the work that we did. And then this will help us, I think, inform future grants we write for other large audiovisual materials we hold in special collections. And I think the other rewarding thing was touched on in the presentations by Dr. Pearson and Dr. Geiken, and also you, Dr. Frank, is just making these films available to the general public for really the first time on a wide platform via our digital collection. You know, these films are what we in the profession call a hidden collection, hidden in the truest sense that these were in our backlog and unprocessed and undiscoverable. So just having the opportunity through the funding provided by CLEAR to get these digitized and then make them available on a worldwide platform is really special. And to see how Dr. Pearson and Dr. Geiken show how they're applicable in research across multiple disciplines is, you know, very satisfying. I'll let Amanda handle the challenging aspects.
Certainly the pandemic was the most challenging part of carrying this grant project through. We were actually notified that we were awarded the grant in May of 2020, so shortly after lockdown happened. And CLEAR was generous enough to give all grantees 6 additional months to complete the grant work, which we definitely needed. So that certainly impacted our work hugely. And, you know, we had to get special dispensation to actually work in the same room together and pack up the films to send off to our vendor for digitization, which was, you know, that was interesting, being masked up and doing this work. So yeah, that was definitely the most challenging part.
Thank you. I'm seeing now some more questions coming in the chat. So one of these, the question: what is the potential for these films to be used in the future? is this an exciting development for future tree ring research? So I'll direct that firstly to Charlotte Pearson, and then I would suggest that Dr. Geiken could also chime in for his studies.
Okay, well, thanks, Laura, for the question. I think, of course, I mean, I'm fascinated to find out more about these, particularly though, let's think about the cycloscope, because we have it. You've probably walked past it several times in the lab on the second floor, and it will be wonderful to see what the Center for Creative Photography exhibition does with that in concert with these movie clips. It will be really, really interesting to further deconstruct how this instrument actually worked, how those get it set up as well as we can, and maybe even see it working would be amazing. So I'm very excited about that.
And I'll just add to that. I think one of the kind of possible and clearly it's happening, since they're going to be included in this. I don't know anything about the Center for Creative Photography, but my guess is that it's in part interested in photography as an art form. I mean, these are weird movies. They are visually arresting. They're often kind of baffling, and so I think, you know, there is a tradition of science images, science film being reused because of the visual interest. So that's, you know, a kind of offshoot. I mean, I am curious. I mean, is there any contemporary use for the planetary interpolator, or is there an app for that now? You know, is there anything? Because what I kept wondering when I was looking at the films, I didn't look at all of them, but I was curious. Like, it seemed like most of the films were sort of documenting his work. Did he use cinema at all, as far as you could tell, Charlotte, to actually make primary observations?
I don't know how much of, I mean, I think some of that record specifically showing that 11-year cycle, that pattern of the 11-year cycle, that he really felt was quite a major breakthrough. And he has sort of a 3-volume publication talking about these cycles. So I think it was, but maybe not actually, you know, used it to convey the message in a different way, to explain this equipment, to communicate the science. I'm not sure that it has a sort of a, you know, that he's actually using the film with a scientific function, but maybe there was some aspect of that, because, you know, you saw it sort of progressing through these different cycles, and maybe there was a kind of an interactive component to that we still don't quite know.
Well, thank you. The chat is filling up. There's a question for Trent and Amanda. Had any or much of the film decayed beyond recovery?
So in what the film that we found in the collection, it was all did suffer some serious deterioration, but not to the point where it wasn't able to be recovered. Does that right?
Yeah, there were no films that were lost, and none to the point that they were totally unrecoverable, as Trent said. They were actually in really good shape for how old they were, luckily.
Yeah, so we're fortunate in that. So, but that's not to say, you know, these films could not exist in some nooks and crannies beneath, you know, the football stadium or wherever, any other archive that holds tree ring materials, because it could be the opportunity where he might have loaned films to some of his colleagues and they wound up in his collection, or any other way these things could have gone to various locations. But thankfully, the ones that we have under our stewardship were able to be recovered.
And I'll ask kind of a follow-up question directed to Oliver, if I may. Do you have a sense if there's, you know, films where there, or maybe Trent and Amanda, where there's, you know, like a part 3 labeled, but we don't see a part 1 and 2 in the right, you know, so I think the films that made it to special collections, you were able to recover, but do we have a sense if there's, a considerable amount of footage that Douglass took that didn't make it? Is there any evidence for that?
From the research that I did in his papers that we hold, I couldn't find any evidence that there were any further films. But as Trent says, that doesn't mean that they don't exist, but there were no portions of films that are looking for sequels out there somewhere. This definitely was a complete collection as far as I could tell.
Dr. Geiken, do you have any further comments on that?
Well, I mean, not on that directly, but I will use this as an opportunity to bring my question to the fore, which is for Amanda, I guess, and Trent. To the extent that you've been able to figure this out, how were these films used? What did he do with them? Are there accounts of this in the paper archive?
So I did find within his correspondence, even in that letter that I showed where he was trying to find the still photographs, that he was using films and photographs in lectures, in conferences that he attended specific to his discipline. So there is evidence of that, but beyond that, I'm not completely sure if they were just sort of like, records for himself. I would imagine that was another use, but it's definitely a question that bears further research.
I'd like to just echo one comment in the chat and then ask one final question. Echo from our colleague Tom Fleming in the astronomy department, who wanted to share about the favorite clip being the Steward Public Evening, Steward Observatory, and noting that Douglass started this program in 1922, and this continues to today. And I think that that's indicative and reflective of the very strong level of outreach, the activities that runs across campus to the university, throughout the University of Arizona, and to all of the stakeholders. And then Tom Fleming noted just about the planetary interpolator was used to schedule observations for the Mars opposition. And the final question, and I think that's a very good one to close off on, is, so we've seen the website, the event, how can a group like the Special Collections make it clear to the world that these materials exist? And a comment, I wonder how many other incredible archives exist that people don't know how to look for and don't discover. So what are the plans to be sure that the world knows about this collection?
So that is a really good question that has confounded archivists, I think, since the profession has started. One of the things we do as archivists are outreach events such as this, where we let the general public know essentially what we have available in the institution, and do more specialty things for disciplines like the tree ring lab, to talk about dendrochronology and all that good stuff. But we also try to build strong relationships with faculty on campus, researchers that come in to the facility, and also reach out to us via email. So it's just one of those things where we're always constantly looking for opportunities to spread the word about, what we have, what we do, that these materials are available to anybody as long as if they show up. All you need is a photo ID to access these materials. And Veronica, do you want to add some things maybe on this?
Sure. I think that's where the what we call the processing piece comes in, where Amanda and Trent in this case would work on description of the materials in such a way that are found through our mechanisms that exist now on the web, the browsers, Google, Yahoo, all of those browsers. So that's part of why it's so important for us to have an online presence and a digital format. It adds to the access to these materials. So people may not be thinking about dendrochronology necessarily in looking for films, but they might be looking for film and some other topic. And as long as the items are described in such a way that they can be found broadly, then they can be, again, found through our regular mechanisms of the web. I mean, that's been the very positive thing for archives, is the web and our presence on our websites, because we can add additional access that way. But also Amanda and Trent, in addition to bringing the news of these collection of these particular films or other collections for others to scholars who are studying them, and then they write papers. You know, they also present at conferences. They also write papers, both on disciplinary journals, and sometimes that, you know, things like Journal of the West or something like that. So it's a multi-pronged way of providing access and knowledge of these kinds of collections out there. But the web is a big part of that component. I hope that helps in answering the question.
It does. Thank you. Veronica, are you wrapping this up, or with the last words?
Sure,
From my side, I just wanted to thank all of the panelists and all of the participants. So, and I'll turn the floor over to you, Veronica.
Sure. So I want to just deeply, from the bottom of my heart, thank all of the panelists, Amanda and Trent, for pulling this project together, Dr. Geiken, Dr. Pearson, and certainly Dr. Frank, for your not just for the panel, but for your support for the project. Without the support of scholars in the area, we wouldn't have gotten the funding. So that is such an important and key aspect of us being able to preserve these films. Otherwise, we couldn't have done it. So, you know, I hope that you've gotten a glimpse through this event of how film preservation, or really source documentation, preservation of source documentation, can provide us with evidence of, in this case, the intersection of the work of science and the quotidian, and evidence of women in science. And it's surely an opportunity to see through these films how the past has informed the present. So, you know, we love our source documentation, and I hope that you all have gotten a sense of how important these are. I want to also thank, of course, the Council for Library and Information Resources for the important Recordings at Risk grant they make possible in order to make this project possible. And a reminder that the recording of this event will be available on our Special Collections website, along with recordings of other programs that we've had. And please visit Special Collections, the website, and to see not only this, but other collections that might be available to you. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.